Welcome, everyone. I still see people joining, but since we are right on time, I will officially say hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to our July edition of Data Talk series, organized by the Data Innovation Lab at the German Federal Foreign Office. Our topic for today is AI and election, insights from the EU election. And my name is Branka Panic, and I'm a senior advisor today. I will start by introducing our hosts, established by the German Federal Foreign Office and administered by GovTech Campus Germany in June 2023. Data Innovation Lab aims to play a pivotal role in advancing a future where human-centered and data-driven insights are integrated to foster sustainable development, technological progress, and global cooperation. This new platform facilitates not only national, not only German, but also regional, European, and global collaboration and partnerships among experts in foreign policy, but also local actors, civil society organizations, different UN agencies, tech entrepreneurs, governments, private sector, and academia. By testing and refining various policy and creative data and AI solutions to advance foreign policy, Data Innovation Lab provides a testing ground for innovative collaboration and tech discovery, promoting ethical practices and supporting multilateral processes. To enhance the awareness of foreign policy actors and other stakeholders regarding data science, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies, Data Innovation Lab is hosting these monthly conversations, data talks. And we invite all of you who are new to the data talks to see some of the previous editions with various topics covered, including AI ethics, AI and sustainability, data spaces, data colonialism, and many more. And you can find these discussions on the Data Innovation Lab YouTube channel, and my colleagues will also share the link to the data talks in the chat. This will be our last session before the summer break. And our today's topic, as I said, is AI and elections, something that we are intensively following in the not only in the first half of the year, but even beyond. But in 2024, I will try to just give a context why we decided to dedicate a specific data talk to this topic. In 2024, the global participation in elections is unprecedented, with over 4 million people who are voting, covering more than 60 countries across the world. And motivated by recent elections, but also some of the upcoming elections, we look at this transformative impact of AI and other emerging technologies on democracies. While AI offers powerful tools for voter engagement, for civic discourse, it also brings some significant risks. Malicious actors can manipulate public opinion, spread disinformation, create deepfakes, threatening election integrity. We are already witnessing some consequences of these developments in some of the recent elections, not only in this year, in the previous year as well, or years, such as Bangladesh, Slovakia, Indonesia, India, Mexico, EU, and many more. And reflecting on these experiences, we acknowledge the need to understand AI's role better in elections and to strengthen the democratic institutions against these emerging threats. So with this, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have great three experts in the field who will be sharing their experiences and lessons learned with us today. And I will shortly introduce them and then immediately pass the floor to them, because I know we have so much to discuss in only an hour. So big welcome to Mark Scott, who is the Chief Technology Correspondent at Politico, writing about the global collision of technology and politics. Prior to joining Politico, Mark was the European technology correspondent for the New York Times, where he covered the continent's response to Silicon Valley's tech giants, the region's push to the digital world, and the expansion of Europe's own technology, media, and telecommunications scene. Mark followed intensively the elections in this year. He wrote about this. We will be sharing after this webinar some of the links and articles that he published. So we are really grateful, Mark, to have you today with us to share your lessons and in covering this specific topic. Second, big welcome to Dr. Katia Munoz. Katia is researcher in democracy and AI at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Katia's research, among many things, includes this specific intersection of artificial intelligence and democracy, with a particular focus on emerging AI trends that reshape online information integrity. She holds a special interest in mapping and monitoring AI's impact on the electoral process, including campaigning, voter sentiment analysis, and governance systems. Welcome, Katia. We look forward to hear about your research. I know that you specifically followed some of the countries that we mentioned in the introduction, so we really look forward to hearing your insights from these specific contexts. And our third panelist, it's a great pleasure to welcome Jeannie Badines, who leads the Democracy Forward, an initiative within Microsoft's Technology for Fundamental Rights organization. Her team is focused on addressing challenges on global democratic stability with efforts aimed at safeguarding open and secure elections, promoting healthy information ecosystem, and advocating for corporate civic responsibility. In 2024, a key focus of her work is raising awareness about the deceptive use of AI in elections, combating these cyber and AI-enabled threats, and many, many more things. Jeannie, it's a great pleasure to bring the big tech to the conversation as well. We know this conversation has to be made across different sectors and different institutions. And I know, again, I say this every time, I cannot do justice to all of your biographies in this short introduction. So if you wish to elaborate more on your expertise, please feel free to do this in your introductions. But without further ado, I really want to give floor to you, and I will open with a joint question for all three of you, so we can guide your introductions. And as we begin this discussion, could each of you share your main observations from the past 6 months regarding the intersection of elections and artificial intelligence? And specifically, I'm interested in how have you seen AI influencing elections or maybe even policymaking during this period? And since I know this topic is not new for you, you did not start researching this at the beginning of this big election year. You've been in the space for many years. I also want to bring to this introductory question the question if anything surprised you. I know you had many expectations about the big election year. So if you can share with our audiences if there were any surprises for you in the first half of 2024. So I'm passing the floor first to Mark.
Branka, thank you so much, and thank you so much for letting me join the esteemed panel that I have alongside me. So how do we begin? There's obviously been a lot of hype around AI, dating back to primarily when ChatGPT was launched back in November 2020, October 2022. All this is about the idea that this new technology could do something to the election cycle, similar to what we saw with the rise of social media back, say, 10, 15 years ago. A couple of things that I think is worth laying out. AI is many things to many people, and AI has been around for decades. It is also an agnostic tool. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. So the assumption that all AI is good or all AI is bad, we just need to maybe calm down the expectation of what it can and can't do. What's been really interesting to see in the first 6 months of the year, as you say, there's been so many elections coming, is that yes, AI has played a role. It is inevitable that AI is going to play a role, but AI has been playing a role, again, like I said before, for many years. And I think in this election cycle, because it is so big, there's been a focus primarily on generative AI, the sort of chat GPTs of this world, mostly because I think everyone on the call has tried it out. Other generative AI models are available, obviously not just chat GPT. And maybe type in things and it spouts back things that look very human-like. Images being created also very human-like. So there is a quick response to go from the policy-making circles of, this is something new, we need to fix it, we need to come up with a solution. Maybe Ginny will get onto some of the corporate responses too. What we have seen in the first 6 months, though, is it has not, these fears or hype has not really met the reality of the situation. We can get into specific case studies, say in Pakistan, when frankly Imran Khan ran his election from prison via generative AI. That is a use case of the technology being put to work in an election. But the fears around mass deepfakes and content created by generative AI being spouted at would-be voters across the world, it has happened to a degree, but not in any way that we thought it would, or many thought it would. And there's not really any empirical evidence about it changing voter outcomes. Franklin, you mentioned the point about Slovakia. Last fall, there was a deepfake audio released right when people were voting, and there was a fear that might have changed voter outcomes. There is no evidence of that. There is an assumption maybe that it could have affected people, but as we see time and over again, there are sort of niche use cases on the fringe where we are seeing particularly generative AI come into the forward of the elections, but they haven't really there's no quantifiable evidence yet that they have changed voter outcome. And for me, as much as I like to write about new shiny things, my underlying question comes down to, are people changing their minds because they see an AI generated image, text, etc., primarily via social media? I remain, as a Democrat with a small d, very skeptical of that concept, mostly because to suggest that one voter with complex political persuasions seeing a generative AI image of a politician and that categorically changing her perspective on an election, that's not how people work. And so I think as we go into this year, I think the thing that I've noticed and has been influential on AI is that there is an expectation that it does more than it can do. Just like, say, back in 2012, 2014, there was an expectation that social media would change voter outcomes. And we need to see this in a broader context where people are reading newspapers, they're talking to friends, they're chatting on WhatsApp groups. AI is just another element to this political conversation that we are having. It is by no means changing everything, but it is obviously having a material effect in certain fringe cases. And then the final point I would do before handing off to my esteemed colleagues is that there is a material difference that I'm seeing between the so-called global north and the global majority countries. Where I'm seeing the most forward-looking uses of AI is in Indonesia. It's in, I mentioned Pakistan, it's in India, where there is a greater use of these techniques at scale compared to what we're seeing in France, the United Kingdom, the European Union elections in the US. It is happening in those sort of Western countries, but I would argue that where we are seeing real change and where things are moving faster is in those global majority countries for a variety of reasons we can get into. So I think with that, that's a very quick overview of where I'm seeing the first 6 months of the year.
Thank you, Mark. So many interesting points already. I just have to say that I appreciate that you started with demystifying this idea that generative AI actually is the only thing that impacts elections and that the AI is much older. However, maybe that's that connection with the global majority countries. And I look forward to starting conversation on this just to see how the accessibility of these tools may be made generative AI, a different type of AI than what we were seeing before. But a great teaser for a discussion. Thanks, Mark, so much for opening our conversation today. I will pass the floor to Katya now.
Thank you. Thank you also for this perfect transition, I would say, because I'm going to focus on AI and political campaigning, because that's where I see most of the innovation happening. Because I completely agree with you, the expectation of manipulative deepfakes or synthetic content in general on disinformation, not that it hasn't occurred, but like this super event hasn't really occurred, hasn't materialized. So I agree with you completely on that, Mark. Yeah, but about AI in political campaigning. That's something that I have seen where I see a lot of trend lines, and I see a scale that has obviously, for obvious reasons, because of access, is unprecedented in scale. And I've seen it in a very open and transparent way to mobilize, to reaffirm beliefs, and to polarize, kind of. And the general observations based on the cases that I've studied, because I'm looking at this from my research project on, where I look at Mexico, South Africa, India. I look at some cases in the EU Parliament, which is Germany, France, Poland, Slovakia, Italy, Belgium, and Netherlands. Sounds a lot, but I have partner organizations working with me, and I'm looking at the US election. Okay, so there are two general trends that I'm seeing in political campaigning. First of all, AI will be increasingly deployed in political campaigning, which is a clear fact for me, and it will be much more data-driven. So political parties and actors are working to an extent of gathering data and also analyzing data, and then using that to scale and fragment and personalize political communication. And the other one is, we already talked about this, and like I've already talked about this, is the AI is obviously supercharging a lot of digital strategies that are already very effective. And I would say one of those I want to highlight would be the weaponization of algorithms, which I'm going to go and talk after for a while. But let's just come up to some examples, which I've seen, to give you some tangible cases of what I mean by AI really having an impact on political campaigning. First of all, I've seen a lot of deepfakes, but yeah, and they were not labeled, but they were very transparently deepfakes, and they were not created to deceive or to, how do you say, place a specific narrative into a consciousness of a demographic or something, but to confirm existing beliefs, to trigger strong emotional responses of fear, of anger, hype, fun, or even of pride, of national pride in a sense. And most of them can be taken with the wink of an eye. If you look in India, for instance, of Modi dancing Bollywood style through the street, or of also Imran Khan, sitting very presidential. I mean, he's in jail, but he's sitting there and having his chat, giving his talk. Or in Indonesia also, where the candidate was rebranding himself and he was cutified, of kind of taking away the attention of his human rights abuse. So those are things that I've definitely seen. And also in France, which I thought was really funny, to the run-up of this snap election. Now there were some influencers who created deepfakes of themselves, very transparently also. I mean, it was nothing that was there to deceive, but kind of coming up with this framing of being proud to be part of Le Pen's family, let's say, pretending to be, in a very obvious manner. So this is one of the trends that I've seen. The other one is, obviously, none of them label their ID content. And we're seeing in Q4, to the run-up to the European Parliament election, for instance, the ID faction, the Identity and Democracy faction, where Le Pen, for instance, is also a member of. The parties in that faction, they used a lot of AI, content-generated content, but they didn't label it. And they were, before that, they actually had signed a code of conduct, a voluntary, to label, but they didn't. So that's a fact. And I know that in Germany, also the Alternative for Germany used also AI synthesized content without labeling. That's another. So the no labeling thing is also a trend. The other one is the exponential, hyper-personalized and scalable political communication. I've seen that in India, where we actually have Gen AI avatars being sent over to personal WhatsApp accounts and to talk to them. Some of the receivers were not even aware that that they're talking to a Gen AI avatar. I mean, some of them were, but still, the political message was very tailored in the sense of talking to people in a specific region and telling them about the economic benefits that they had received. And that they should continue voting for that party because, they would benefit even longer. We also see that in Germany, for instance, and not only far-right parties, in the sense like the Volt Germany party, and also in general in all of Europe, was very data-driven, and they were able to scale political communication on an extent and analyze data to really target voters over a pan-African message that they created, in a sense. Then there's the fragmentation of personalized political communication. You had people talking in different languages and adapted mimicry as well. I mean, India has 10 official languages. In the US, you have strong minorities with Spanish speaking. And I'm pretty sure that this will be something that, is definitely a vulnerability in AI impact in a sense. People really not only having the simultaneous how do you say, translation, but really changing the mimicry, because it makes something with you. If you see somebody speaking in your language, you connect to them much better in a way. And if that's not labeled, you do not have the choice of having that distance. You just connect to somebody with that. And another vulnerability, or let's say, another vulnerability that I encountered, I mean, we've seen it in New Hampshire where it didn't really matter, but what about robocalls to suppress voting in specific areas in the US? That's something that I definitely see coming.
Katja, we lost your sound.
Sorry, I came to the tab. So another thing that I saw is that Meta, for instance, I haven't really looked at Google, but they were monetizing off far-right content in Germany, which was AI generated. And that's a breach of two things. First of all, they have this new policy on AI manipulated ads in general that is not allowed if not labeled. And the second is that it's obviously those ads contained hate speech, stoking hate and division. So there's a twofold breach, but nothing happened. So that's another trend, like platforms in this sense, again, not fulfilling that promise. Maybe it's because it's the first time, I don't know, but that happened also already in the EU Parliament elections. And now to the last point, I mentioned the weaponization of algorithms. What I mean by that is we're talking about something that has been very fringe knowledge before. It's kind of like the pebble in the pond. If you throw something in and then there's no choice but for the algorithm to react to it. And I find that influencers really fit the bill in this sense because they are high reach accounts who post a post. Then they have this chain of networks that they constructed beforehand. It takes time to come up with something like this. Where mid-tier influencers or high reach accounts take that post and multiply it. And then you have the nano influencers, like the smaller ones, the really smallest unit in the sense, to again multiply that message and and that's amplifying that narrative. And what happens is the same as with the ripple as the pond. There's no choice but for the algorithm, which is engagement driven, to actually take up that post and then react to it and recommend it to others, right? So this is something that I have seen extensively in all of these elections, which is actually not really what we call the AI thing. But I've seen some influencers use AI posts or generated posts and using that weaponization of algorithms, because it makes it so much easier to create just one post. And then, the production goes down, the hyper-personalization process and everything. So there's a combination, which I think is kind of like the future in the sense of trying to manipulate voters. I think that's the biggest danger we're falling into. But yeah, we'll see. I've seen that in Germany. I've seen it in France as well. And that's only the case that I've looked at now because it's just too many cases to look at all the data yet. But I think I will finish with that. I think I've talked enough.
Thank you so much, Katja. So many examples. Thanks for bringing so much light to the things that have been happening in the previous 6 months. I'm now very intrigued with this difference of, I don't know if you can call it use and abuse of emerging technologies and AI. What part of this AI use is just business as usual, like using the technology or methods that have been used previously in elections, impacting your voters is a normal part of democratic processes, right? What part of this AI use is now abuse or manipulation or maybe even illegal, and what is not? I'm really curious about this, and I hope we can discuss this further in the discussion part. And the second thing, algorithms and platforms, which I think gives us a great transition to Jeannie and to see what is the role of tech actors now and where do we see this intersection. Jeannie, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Branka. It's always fun to go third because then you're batting clean up from the great speakers that went before. So a lot has already been established. I agree and echo a lot of what my fellow panelists have already said. The way I was thinking of framing this was starting with a bit of what we've seen, since that was the question, though again, a lot of that's already been established here, which is essentially so far in this cycle, we have not seen a lot of use of AI in the deceptive content to deceive people around things like what a candidate truly said or intended, or around anything around the process of voting, which frankly are the two areas that as technology companies, as AI companies, we have really targeted and focused our efforts around, which is essentially that deceptive use. So good news, haven't seen a lot of that, especially from nation state actors. The maybe not bad news, but just sort of the other consideration, which has already been acknowledged, is we're not done yet. We're of course only halfway through the year. And while a large majority of the countries have already voted, we still have a couple critical ones to go. We're obviously in the middle of the French elections. We've got the UK later this week. And then, you know, the elephant in the room, everyone's aware that the US elections, as messy and chaotic as it is still several months away. And of course, we have Ghana and others remaining to go as well. So this is still remains a big election year. And while we haven't seen the sort of big disruptive event yet, we are not resting on our laurels and declaring victory yet, both societally, nor as the technology companies. Rightfully, as I would hope you all would expect for us to do, we continue to be vigilant and concerned and trying to identify potential attack areas. One thing I would sort of draw your attention to, because I think it's and some of you have maybe heard me say this before, but I think it's a better proxy maybe for the US election than to point to any of the previous elections we've seen this year, is to draw attention to some of what we're seeing Russia do around the Olympics, not to change subjects, but to just sort of point out that there are creative uses of AI being deployed by Russia. They've put together a couple of now more than one Netflix-style documentaries about the Olympic Committee, and they use AI. They mix AI, as they tend to do, with real content throughout this documentary, dubbing Tom Cruise's voice as their narrator, really to take on the Olympic Committee. So I just point to that as a example of a ongoing campaign that Russia is waging that might be a better proxy or example for what they could do. Again, not suggesting we've seen this yet in the US. So again, we continue to be vigilant. But to the point of before, when it was, I think Mark was sort of setting the stage of what is different this cycle versus 2016, both the sort of the leveraging of the technology to create disinformation or to stoke chaos. While we haven't seen that yet, there are other differences from the 2016 cycle. And one is what all of the different stakeholders are doing sort of proactively. Obviously, there is a lot we've seen from government. We welcome and would love to see more as well when it comes to sort of regulatory frameworks around AI generally, but also specifically around political campaigns and elections. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been any activity. In fact, there has been in the US. While we haven't seen any federal regulation pass yet, there are some interesting bills that are bipartisan to be watching, but the states have started to pass some legislation. So Michigan, for example, and I know there are others, have passed laws that have essentially said the use of AI to deceive around candidate deepfakes and to deceive around the process of voting is illegal. And they've been very clear about that. And again, I believe California and a few other states have done the same. And then in the EU, we of course see the Code of Practice on Disinformation being implemented here, which is not a regulatory framework quite yet. It's still voluntary, but then there's the backstop of the DSA, which has also started to kick in around this topic. And so there are some government stakeholders who have identified this challenge early, have leaned into it. So that's one thing that I would say is quite different from previous cycles. And then, of course, the technology companies. While I don't technically represent them all, I will attempt to do a little bit of a representation of how the industry is thinking about and approaching these challenges, though I'll sprinkle in some of what Microsoft's doing specifically in there as well. So the first thing that I'd say that we do that we've done that is different than in previous cycles is that we acknowledged that this could and likely will be a challenge and sort of have leaned into that publicly. And so in February, 20 of the world's largest tech companies signed an agreement in Munich at the security conference. It's a tech accord focused on the deceptive use of AI in elections. And it was a few things. One, it was an acknowledgement, as I mentioned, that this could and might in fact be a problem, and that the technology companies are responsible actors in that space, that we have a role to play, and sort of leaned into that responsibility, which I think is important sort of in and of itself. But that wasn't, of course, the entirety of it. We also made some commitments about what that means. and how we'll actually have, many of us have already started and are underway, how we'll actually look to mitigate some of the threats that could pose. So some examples of that, I kind of put them into 3 buckets. There are 8 commitments. I will put the link in here. If you haven't seen this yet, you can go and look through it in more detail. But I put it in 3 main buckets. One is sort of the creation of these deep fakes, and how are the technology companies going to prevent them where appropriate. And so that's a mix of different commitments around things like responsible model creation, as well as at the prompt level, and then at the policy level as well. And so what that looks like practically is saying things like, on Microsoft Bing image creator, you cannot create an image of a political candidate who is actively running for office. That's a policy we have in place. The enforcement is at the prompt and model level. And to the point that Katya made, we don't always get these things right. So please do alert me if you see us not enforcing that or identifying that properly. But by sort of stepping out and saying this is something that we should be doing, we're now holding ourselves accountable to that, and hopefully getting it right in the actual implementation side as well. So in addition to the deepfake creation side, and to note of the companies that are a part of this, we do have those who are sort of AI companies more purely. So we have OpenAI and Anthropic, for example. So that's one really big piece of it. But we're also looking at a lot of the dissemination, and that's sort of the social media side of things. That's where our colleagues from TikTok and X and Meta and Google, and then of course LinkedIn from a Microsoft perspective, have all talked about what does it look like when people are actually consuming information online, and what are our obligations and responsibilities on that side of things. And that's where a lot of the commitments revolve around transparency, labeling, provenance, watermarking. To be clear, we haven't prescribed a single path to do this. And that's both because this is an evolving technology and a lot of us are figuring out the best practices and the right way to do things. We also have different platforms and products. And so obviously the right solution for LinkedIn might not be the same for Xbox, for example. So we're trying to make sure that we're not over prescribing the method by which we do this. At the same time, we are sharing best practices to get to a place where things are going to be clearer to consumers. I will be honest that we are not all there yet, right? The adoption of things like the C2PA standards, while most of the big companies have started to use them in some way or read them, again, depending on what kind of company they are or product they're talking about, we don't have that all perfectly figured out. And those indicators are not always the same across the platforms. That is an area for growth where we'll be leaning in. And that's an area of opportunity. But the good news is that we are sort of marching in that direction. Part of our commitment in the Tech Accord is that we would be working together on these challenges, and we have done that. And continue to. And sort of the third bucket, as I see it across those commitments, is around education. And education is going to apply to a lot of different people. Education to policymakers, working in good faith across different policymakers to ensure they understand what the technology is, what the threats are as we see them, but also, of course, with the general public, with political candidates and campaigns, with election officials. There's a lot that can be done, again, on the sort of 101 basics of AI, but then also to really understand some of the challenges we anticipate, again, that we may not have seen yet, when it comes to the use of this technology in the course of elections. So as Microsoft, some of the things we've done around that is we've actually conducted more than 100 trainings. I don't have the dashboard in front of me, I should, since February, with primarily focused on political campaigns and candidates, also those in sort of the election space generally that support them. Sometimes those are vendors or folks that support the process. And those trainings have really been focused on trying to walk that fine line between awareness of deepfakes without overhyping the threat, but particularly when working with political campaigns and election officials, making sure they've thought through their incident response planning. In many ways, this feels akin to a lot of the work that we've done and continue to do as well on cybersecurity training, which is, if there's a cyber attack, do you know who you're going to call? Have you considered your legal obligations? Have you considered your press strategy? These things that are sort of foundational that most organizations understand they should have in place if they do in fact face a ransomware attack or another kind of cyber attack. We realize that a lot of them have not thought through those same steps when it comes to what if your candidate or an issue or somehow related to your campaign becomes the victim of a deep fake. And so we spend a lot of time with them thinking through those best practices and those next steps. And we'll continue to do that. We've already started that in the US, and we'll continue to do that through this cycle. We also take on sort of the public awareness campaign aspect of it, which frankly, I'll acknowledge is going to be a much bigger lift and is something that more than the tech companies need to engage in. This is an area for government and civil society, but also we have a role to play. Again, to draw awareness to the way that deepfakes might show up in someone's life, whether it's around elections, which is what we're focused on now, but frankly, to give you a little bit of a sense of where we see things going on the fraud side, on sort of the consumer protection side, really knowing that audio deepfakes are actually quite convincing and that they can be it can sound like it's your grandchild calling, asking for money, and it's not actually your grandchild. Like, general awareness campaigns around the use of this technology will, I think, help stem some of the challenges that we'll see going forward with the tech around things like fraud. And of course, there are other areas as well. So that's a lot of the work that we're committed to doing. Again, the other companies are doing aspects of this as well. And then civil society continues to have a key role to play here as a convener, as a researcher. We've seen a lot of great organizations do trainings, again, with similar participants and stakeholders. One aspect of all of this work that comes up a lot, and I'm happy to get into it if this is an area people want to go, is the question of detection. Wouldn't it be easy if we could just, build a great detector and it would tell us if something was AI generated or not? And that is a sort of overly simplistic approach to what's actually, as you peel back the layers, a quite complex challenge when it comes to being able to just detect a deep fake. However, there is a role for detection, particularly for classifiers that can tell you if something was generated on a traditional traditional is a funny term to use here, but a more established AI system like DALL-E, right? There's definitely a role for classifiers in this process. It won't always catch all the deceptive uses, but there is something to that. One partner of ours that's doing great work in this space is called True Media. They're a nonprofit that recently was stood up trying to pull together a lot of the classifiers being used by some of the big technology companies so that media, governments, civil society organizations can get a sense from an image or a video or an audio file if it hits any of those classifiers, if it's likely to be AI generated. There's a lot of work that needs to go into actually understanding those results and responsibly reporting out on them. But it's a good step in sort of bridging the communication gap right now of you have an image in front of you and you just don't know where it came from or whether it was AI generated or enabled. So I'll stop there. Happy to take the conversation where you all might want to go. But again, thanks for having me here.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. And please do share the links in the chat with our audience so we can look further in the tech occurred. Thanks so much for sharing all of this. You reminded me of the work of Hani Farid as well, the professor at the Berkeley University, right? So there's, again, this work about detection is not a new thing. We've been working, the community has been working on this for many years. And now with you listing so many things that have been done on the mitigation side and mitigation strategies, I'm just thinking now spontaneously about this, and I would like to talk with you about this, looping back to Mark's point at the beginning that maybe some of our fears were not responded in reality, right? We did not see so many risks and threats that we were expecting. Is that maybe the reason that we invested so much efforts in mitigation and that actually the risks were understood, or that there's no malicious use or deceptive use of these technologies? This is the question for all three of you. I have not been thinking about this before, but I'm just a little bit afraid now that if we are sending the signal that the risks are not there, the efforts to stop the malicious use will also not be there. And any one of you who wants to respond, Mark, please go ahead.
I'll go. The risks are there. Like, let's be very clear. I mean, and not to knock down the AI election call, which is a great way for the companies to step in. The reason why we haven't seen widespread misuse of this technology yet is purely out of luck, and the bad actors, be it foreign or domestic, just haven't caught up yet. We also have to realize most of this is coming through the vector of social media, and it's very difficult even for an AI-generated image or a regular image to get eyeballs. It's difficult to go viral on social media. And so the way I look at this in the last 6 months is that we haven't seen much widespread misuse, although Katja mentioned some examples from European parliamentary elections, which are very worrying, mostly because that AI-generated content was not called by any of the platforms, despite their commitments to the AI election accord. But where I think we are missing the spectrum is that the risk is there. it's just that for the grace of God, frankly, it just hasn't really had effect on election yet. I would suggest, not to put this in too much of a US context, that we're like an election cycle short of it really having an effect. I think what I see, particularly from political campaigns, is they are tinkering in the back end, trying to use sort of the AI to sort of get really granular information around like voter habits and micro-targeting that are still very much at the early stages. Fast forward to 2026 and say the midterms in the US and frankly another election cycle that's coming globally, that's where I think we'll see real, not harm, but widespread use. So the way I view this currently is the risk is significant. The platforms are doing something, but frankly not enough. But it's just that the technology is so new in terms of generative AI, the real use case, like the killer app, if you will, of how to get to voter intention hasn't been developed yet. We've seen that a little bit in, say, Pakistan and India on that side, although I'm by no means an expert in those two countries' political systems. I just think globally, people are still tinkering with the technology. Fast forward 2 years, we will then, I think, see a solidification of the use case that really gets to voter needs and interests, where right now I do see it quite disparate and dispersed.
I'll push back just a tiny bit to say that I mostly agree with what he just said. However, I do think by raising the bar on entry to some of the more commercially available technologies, we have made it a little bit harder for those who might be trying to create deceptive materials. They have to go find open source products, or they have to go find those that are created outside of the US. So for those who might have been looking to cause a little bit of chaos easily, the return on investment is just higher. And while we can't, as technology companies, gatekeep all the use of technologies from all the bad guys as much as we would love to, we can certainly make the bar a little bit higher for them to get access to it. I don't know if that's necessarily why we haven't seen it this cycle, to Mark's point, but I do think it's made it a little bit harder for those who might have been trying to do so if they'd wanted.
Can I push back a little bit? You just have to look at the generative AI images running in the French election right now that are on X, Instagram, and Facebook, all of which are created primarily by Midjourney, to see that this stuff is out there. And it might not be DALL-E, it might not be the Microsoft products, but there are signatories to the AI election accords whose technology is being used right now in a French election. And I would argue that without any disparity to global majority countries where this is a serious risk, I would have thought maybe, given the fact there's the AI Act and the French are quite big in the global policy space, the companies who are part of the AI election code may want to have paid more attention to what's going on right now in real time in France.
Thank you, Mark and Jeannie, and Katya. Please go ahead, but I will also add a question for you from the chat, and I will invite the audience. Now is the time. Please feel free to either type your questions, if you prefer that, in the chat, or connect directly. And Alex, I see your hand. I will bring you in just after Katya ends her response to the question. And Katya, the direct question for you was, have you seen or studied any gender or ethnicity effects in some of your studies of emerging technologies or AI? And then are there differences in usage along the political spectrum? Thank you, Jasmine. And if you wish to add anything in person, feel free to jump into the conversation. Katya.
That's a good question. I don't know if that counts, but I've seen a lot of far-right content, which is still very fringe. It was not completely illegal, right? So I've seen a lot of content trying to sow division in a way, like creating a picture, a deepfake picture, obviously, where you kind of tackle in primal fear, right? Because it is migrants in Germany, obviously, trying to, I don't know, create the sense of fear that women are not safe from migrant men. So there's this angle of race and division, definitely, and those were monetized as well. And but that's also a poster that was used in the context of communal elections here in Germany. And gendered, I'm not sure if that counts like something, also tradwives or something very traditional images that are being used in this sense. But as I said, those are those are used in political campaigning, not so much to sow disinformation or like to post a specific, but more to post a specific narrative, right? Because that's the image that we want to protect, the women that are unsafe walking down the street, not saying from what they are unsafe, but implying that the reader will fill the space, the blanco in itself. Okay, this is the fear that, it's not men in general, it's migrant men in this sense. That's what I've seen. I haven't really looked at the in disinformation narratives. For me, definitely AI. I mean, it hyper-personalizes everything that is possible. It's super boosts existing strategies. So yes, it's a boon for existing digital strategies. But as I said, we haven't seen the super event. And I wanted to point out something on Slovakia. You were saying, it's like, I'm totally agree with you. We don't really know if it had an effect, because the election result also didn't deviate so much from polls. It is still in the margin of error. And that's why we look at a lot of proxy variables to kind of trying to find out, if there was an effect after. And I find that in Slovakia, I'm not sure if it didn't have an effect, because if we look at trust in government, you can see that the average with the current government was, I don't know, I think around 40–50%, which is usual in Europe by now. And then after the election, which was shortly after the election, they took the same proxy variable again, and it was slightly higher. But that's unlogical if you have, if you have a deepfake of that kind. So maybe people believe. I'm not sure. That's the point with proxy variables. You can't be really sure. But I think the proxy variables allow us to tell a story, or maybe help us in interpreting some of the data points, which are lost if we just look at specific data points. That's something that I just wanted to add to the conversation.
Just really quickly on the gender question, just to acknowledge that the use of deepfakes, let's take the election context out of it for a moment and just say generally where we see this technology actually being used to create harm, it's almost entirely targeted against women. And it's almost entirely like sort of pornographic in nature. And so we are monitoring this very carefully, because we believe that there's likely to be a parallel with, if we do start to see it show up in the election context, we're curious about whether it's going to be targeting female politicians. This is sort of a trend of online harassment. And so bringing together the trend of what we're seeing in other uses of deepfakes and the trend of online harassment targeting female politicians, this feels like a disaster that could be waiting to happen. So it's something that I know that we're monitoring very closely and are super concerned about. We don't have any data to support that at the moment, but it's a really great question and something I think we should all be hyper aware of, because as we know, when women in leadership roles like politicians or journalists are targeted online, it's often to keep them out of or suppress their interest in public life. And so it's a real democracy issue in our perspective if women are being discouraged from participating in the process.
Thank you, Katya and Jeannie, for pointing this out. Just for Jasmine, to add to this, I'm currently based in Mexico and connecting to Katya's research on Mexico elections as well. This was a big dimension of misuse of technology-facilitated violence, right? Attacks against politicians or activists of specific gender. And I completely agree with you, Jeannie. We need more data for this. We are not even sure that catastrophe did not happen. Maybe we just don't have data to show it. And when we talk with women and candidates and politicians and activists, journalists, for journalism, it's a big problem in Latin America, right? Technology facilitated violence. So we definitely need more data and more transparency in this direction from the platforms themselves as well. So we are actually able to show what is happening and what kind of impacts are out there. Good. Alex Azazi, thanks so much for your patience. Would you like to ask your question directly?
Yes, thank you very much. Good to see you, Branka. It seems to me that regardless of what the good or bad AI players are doing or not doing, one of the most disturbing trends in all of these countries is that large swaths of the electorate are basically choosing to believe what they want to believe, regardless of the facts that are being presented again and again and from credible sources. For example, here in the US, large swaths of the electorate think the economy is terrible, although for themselves it's pretty good. They choose to believe it's bad, or data on crime in big cities, et cetera, et cetera. And I assume this is the case in France and Germany as well. I'm just curious to hear from the panelists. Any thoughts how AI for good can be used to get people to break out of these, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of self-inflicted disinformation bubbles? Just generally, any thoughts along those lines? And have you seen cases where AI has been used effectively to break through, or any thoughts on this?
I'll go. There is a trend in this gets a little bit wonky, so forgive me. There's a trend in content moderation where you get to the point where you can't just fact check everything, right? We can discuss sort of disinformation, which is sort of the going out to try and fool people, versus the misinformation where people just say believe in things that aren't true. I mean, again, that's democracy. Just, again, there's a limit what you can do there. But with AI, what's an interesting trend in content moderation in terms of you can take the fact checks about, I don't know, say the COVID vaccine does something awful, which it obviously doesn't, and then use large language models to scale those responses. So you're reaching more people quicker rather than having an army of fact checkers sort of typing in and debunking things. Large language models are quite an effective tool to do such fact checking in real time at scale. Does that break you out of sort of the media ecosystem bubbles that many of us now live in? Well, no. I mean, we could discuss sort of tweaking algorithms in social media and providing alternative voices, and that's one thing. But I think I think we have to admit where large language models can play a significant role in terms of just getting real-time debunked information to as many people as possible. AI does provide an opportunity to do that at scale, where a ream of very good fact checkers just can't do because of just the numbers of people required. So I think what we are now seeing, both in the US, here in Europe, I can't speak to global majority countries because, again, I'm not going to pretend what's going on in Indonesia or Pakistan. We are seeing that starting to happen. Is it too late for this cycle? It is, unfortunately, just because cost, budgetary constraints, etc. But I do think that is a real good use of AI, to your point, where you can get in and provide fact-checked information to an audience. Will they believe that information? Well, that's a whole different matter. But in terms of just getting it out at scale, AI does provide an opportunity.
So basically, Mark, what you're talking about is essentially referred to as claim verification. That's XYZ entity or person makes a claim or a series of claims, and to use LLMs to verify those claims at scale in real time, hopefully.
I mean, that is an opportunity. I think, again, with all the 10 minutes we have left, I think we can get into how do we digital media literacy over decades, and how do you sort of provide people with different sources of information. That's a whole different thing. But in terms of putting out the immediate fire that is some of the disinformation campaigns that are happening, I do think that you can use LLMs at scale to do that quicker than you can, say, with traditional fact checking.
Yeah, there are also other measures, but this is also something that can be done. It hasn't been implemented yet on scale, but I completely agree that's one measure. But then the other thing is, because there's so many sources, I mean, that's the problem. There's so much information online, that's why we talk about the integrity of the information in the information space. And then there's also the fact that a lot of the threat actors know about cognitive warfare, about cognitive biases. So what you were referring to is that if it's just what you believe, doesn't matter what kind of, if you get information, you kind of sort it and justify it towards your belief. That's the confirmation bias. Then there's this other thing that, if there's so much spam, like Mark was just saying, of one source, then AI can actually, fact check in real time. So the availability bias. So if you see something a lot, then you think maybe it's true, right? But that can be circumvented or prevented even, or combated in a way with this. There's also another way. I just read about a study, which is actually pretty interesting, about what about flat earthers, really? Because there's some, it's getting bigger, let's face it. And usually you would say it's a flat earther, you can't really say anything because they're very, very beyond trusting. But there's actually now, they've had this AI chatbot experience where they've had this person who really believed in conspiracy theories. They didn't even believe that that a tree is called a tree because the school told them that it's a tree. So they didn't believe in it. So what do you do with people like that? And there, an LLM, like a chatbot, was very helpful because they continuously bombarded them with facts. Whatever question there was no, because it's an LLM. So it can react in real time. It can react constantly, and it can react hyper-personalized to the questions that you ask. And it was a fact. Like, I mean, it was just one study, but still, this is a chance because you can actually help them with it. But will it be rolled out? Who will be signing up for that, right? Like, how do you get these models to these people? And then the other thing is, I find, because in Germany we have, and also it's not only in Germany, it's the whole Europe, and also I guess in the US we have this doppelganger thing going on. You know, Russia kind of duplicating, let's say, news sources that then people might read and believe because it might be CNN. It's just CNN and .com or something. It's like this duplicated website. So what do you do? And I find that one of the things that you could use is something like, I've also heard about it just recently. It's like a unique media identifier that once you see it, so it's about rating news sources. Actually, that's something AI can also do, like rating news sources so that you have, I mean, you can still see everything because we live in democracies. We can't really censor anything, but at least you see a rating. Okay, so this is a real news site, and this or the other might be, I don't know, like rated only with 1 star or no star. That gives you a choice, an option to read and see what is possible. So these are things that are still in the tryout phase, but I think potentially there's good stuff there depending on, you know, where the incentive is to do that.
So Ginny, what's the incentive for Microsoft to implement these? Does it conflict with profits, the profit motive, or how do you see it?
No, we're implementing a lot of these kinds of solutions. I will point to more of what Katja was saying there at the end, which is our perspective on it tends to be very much based on the source of the information and trying to give people more information about the source that they're consuming so that they can make choices about what they read and how they consume it. And then in the case of more authoritative sources, we give those additional bumps, right? So if you are the National Association of Secretaries of State and you are saying information about the election, that is a more authoritative source than some random blog, right? These are things that we all know, but we need to be able to quantify and apply in direct ways within our products. So we have organizations we work with like NewsGuard and GDI and some others who do some of the work that Katja was referring to, actually looking at publishers and sites and giving them essentially scores based on not on the content of each of their articles, but more the way they do business to identify that they are in fact journalist organizations that follow basic principles of integrity. So, you know, we're very much subscribed to that belief and follow that within our products.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Alex, for your questions. This is the very last question because we are unfortunately running out of time. Do you also have reflections on the use of AI in elections in fragile contexts, such as Somalia, Haiti, Sudan, South Sudan? And I will just, I have to add additional ones, sorry, but your introductions really motivated me to think, especially Mark, when you said that so many of these examples that we saw in the first half of the year were actually coming from global majority countries, and thinking that the US elections are only to come, and learning from some previous examples where global majority was used as a testing ground for some of these tools to actually be used in the US elections. Do you see this or expect maybe the similar pattern for some of these examples just to now be used on scale in US elections? So you have 2 questions now. Please pick which one you want to answer briefly.
I'll go again first. I'm going to leave the Somalia, Haiti, Sudan question mostly because I do not know enough about those countries to make a valid judgment. I just want to mention something about the global majority countries. I think I equate this to sort of the shift to 4G or the shift from dumb phones to smartphones, to kind of skip laptops. There is, again, this is a massive generalization, so forgive me, but the use cases of Gen AI I'm seeing in the global majority are just at a level more sophisticated than we're seeing currently in more developed countries. We can discuss why, but I think sometimes this is about trying to meet a technology gap and they're just shifting. They don't need to go through different gears of campaigning when they can just go right to the generative AI toolbox. And where I think we will see some swinging back, which we saw similar to in the social media era, some of these eventually coming back to the global north, the developed countries. In what context? I don't know. I think we should be focusing primarily on campaigns use of AI on the back end to sort of target voters things we don't want to get to see, but are vitally important to elections. In terms of creating deepfake videos and using auto translation like Modi did, that will come. But I think that the context is so different, say, in the US compared to India, it's difficult to see currently how you would sort of take one and put it into the other context.
Katya and Jeannie, any last words from you? Go ahead, Katya, please.
I would definitely, yeah, just very quick. I would definitely say some of those trends that I've listed are portable. I mean, that's like the goal of why we do so many comparative cases, but it really depends on the context, right? It's not only are they portable technically, but something that Mark also said, what about the spread of smartphone use or dumb phone use? You know, like what is the digitization rate? What is the user preference in platform usage, like in different countries? In South Africa, for instance, you might not have, as TikTok is kind of big, WhatsApp is pretty big. Twitter is very elite. Not a lot of people use it in a way. And then also the political ads, which I find very interesting. That's something that I find more in Western. But also, what is the regulation? You know, what is data protection? What is privacy protection? Those are things like sending a political ad via WhatsApp to a phone. That's not very likely in, let's say, the EU. But that's very likely in India and might even be very likely in the US because I mean, you can just buy the data by now from data brokers. So some things are very portable, and those are things that I'm highlighting for me, for myself. And some trends are adapted, but still portable. But the beauty of research is to find out to what extent, right? What is exactly going to be the tweak in the specific content, and then see what impact it has. But then, you know, how you have to define impact. So it gets complicated, but yes, we will see portable trends.
I know we're at time. All I'll add is, while I don't have any specific insights around elections in those countries, it's important to make sure that the entirety of the world gets to be part of the AI transformation. And so that means making sure that folks in some of those countries have electricity and have access to the internet, broadband connectivity, in order for them to even have access to the tools that are available to them with AI. We recognize that also means opening them up to a lot of the weaponization side as well, but just sort of noting that these are a lot of environments where AI is likely not to have a huge impact quite yet, just given the lack of those other functions in those countries.
Jeannie, Katya, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time. This was an excellent discussion, and we opened so many more questions. And I hope we will have more opportunities to continue this conversation. I'm also very grateful to the audience. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for listening to us. We recorded this session for those of you who were not able to join us. And at the end, a big thank you to the Data Innovation Lab and the German Federal Foreign Office as well for recognizing this as an important topic and allowing us to facilitate this conversation together. Thank you so much. We will be following your work and maybe see you at the end of 2024 to see what happened at the end of the year.
Yay.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.